October 17th, 865 AD. The marshlands of East Anglia. A farmer named Wulfric stumbled upon something that would haunt the collective memory of Anglo-Saxon England for generations. Half buried in the cold mud near the River Yare, he discovered not the body of a fallen warrior, but the skeletal remains of a young woman clutching an infant. Both bodies showed identical bite marks, deep tearing wounds that stripped flesh from bone. The marks were too large for wolves, too methodical for wild dogs. Standing 20 paces away, partially obscured by morning fog, Wulfric saw them, 3 massive hounds, each standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, their eyes tracking his every movement. These were not English dogs. Their build was wrong. Their behavior was wrong. And around the neck of the largest, a leather collar bore runic inscriptions he couldn't read. But the truth was far more terrifying than mere attack dogs. Before we uncover the truth about the Great Heathen Army's hounds and how Norse invaders weaponized Scandinavian hunting breeds against Anglo-Saxon refugees, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Now let's step back into one of the darkest chapters of the Viking Age, where man's best friend became his most efficient executioner. The year 865 AD marked a turning point in English history that would reshape the island forever. For decades, Viking raids had terrorized the coastal monasteries and villages of Britain, hit-and-run attacks, smash-and-grab operations. Violent, yes, but temporary. The longships would appear on the horizon, the Norsemen would take what they wanted, and then they'd vanish back across the North Sea. The English kingdoms had learned to live with this terrifying reality, building their churches inland, posting watchmen along the coasts, paying tribute when necessary. But in the autumn of 865, something changed. The Great Heathen Army, Marshlands here, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it, arrived not to raid but to conquer. Led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, this wasn't a raiding party of a few hundred warriors. This was an invasion force estimated between 3,000 and 5,000 strong. They came in a fleet so vast that when they landed in East Anglia, witnesses claimed the ships stretched along the coast as far as the eye could see. East Anglia in 865 was a kingdom living on borrowed time. King Edmund ruled a realm already weakened by internal conflicts and previous Viking incursions. His kingdom encompassed what is now Norfolk, Suffolk, and parts of Cambridgeshire, fertile agricultural land crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with small farming communities. These were people who worked the land their grandparents had worked, who worshipped in the same wooden churches their fathers had built, who expected their children to inherit the same peaceful existence. They were catastrophically unprepared for what was coming. What made the Great Heathen Army different wasn't just its size or its ambition, it was its methodology. This force intended to stay, to establish permanent settlements, to take the land itself. And they had brought with them not just weapons and supplies, but something the English had never encountered in warfare before, specially bred, systematically trained Scandinavian hunting hounds designed for one purpose: tracking and bringing down human prey. The Norse had been breeding these dogs for generations. In the harsh environments of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, they developed powerful hunting breeds capable of bringing down elk, bear, and wild boar. These weren't the smaller, gentler herding dogs common in England. These were elkhounds, early predecessors to what we might recognize as Norwegian elkhounds and Swedish jamthunds, dogs bred for stamina, fearlessness, and the abil, to track prey across vast distances. But in the hands of the Great Heathen Army, these noble hunting companions were transformed into something else entirely. The first villages in East Anglia noticed them in late October 865. Strange sounds in the night, deep resonant baying unlike anything their own dogs made. Livestock killed not by wolves, England knew wolves, but by something larger, more powerful. Sheep torn apart with surgical precision, cattle hamstrung and left to bleed. And then the refugees began arriving from the coast. The village of Beaudrysesworth, modern-day Bury St. Edmunds, was where the pattern first became impossible to ignore. November 3, 865 AD. A local priest named Alfric recorded in the church annals that 3 families had arrived at dawn, their clothing torn, their feet bloody from running through the marshes all night. They brought with them a story that seemed too horrible to believe. The Vikings had landed near their coastal settlement. This much was expected. But instead of burning and pillaging in their traditional fashion, the Norsemen had released dozens of massive hounds into the surrounding countryside before the main force even disembarked. They sent the beasts first, one survivor, a fisherman named Osric, told Aelfric. We heard them in the darkness, not howling like wolves, baying, hunting. They worked in packs of 3 or 4, driving people from their homes, herding them like sheep toward the shore where the Vikings waited. Osric described how his neighbor, a blacksmith named Godwin, had tried to fight off one of the hounds with an iron poker. The dog, Osric insisted it was too large to be called merely a dog, had taken the blow without flinching, circled around and torn out Godwin's hamstring before the man could strike again. It knew, Osric said, his hands still trembling as he spoke. It knew exactly where to bite to bring a man down without killing him. They wanted us alive. The priest recorded these accounts, but admitted in his notes that he wasn't certain what to make of them. Surely fear and darkness had exaggerated the size and intelligence of simple hunting dogs. Surely the trauma of the attack had colored the survivors' memories. He wouldn't remain skeptical for long. By mid-November, the pattern had expanded. The Great Heathen Army had established a fortified camp near Thetford and was systematically extending its control over the surrounding territory. But they weren't doing it primarily through direct military confrontation. They were using the dogs. A wool merchant named Edric, traveling from Norwich to Cambridge, witnessed what he called the Viking hunt firsthand. From a height on the edge of a forest, he watched as Norse warriors released 6 hounds in a coordinated pattern around a small hamlet. The dogs didn't attack immediately. Instead, they took up positions at the cardinal points around the village, cutting off escape routes. Then, on some signal Edric couldn't discern, they began moving inward, barking and snarling, driving the villagers toward the center of their own settlement. They were being herded, Edric later testified before a hastily assembled council of East Anglian nobles. The dogs worked like trained hunting animals pursuing deer, but their quarry was people, women, children, the elderly. It made no difference. The hounds showed no mercy, no hesitation. The Vikings would then enter the village unopposed, the population already corralled and terrified, and make their demands. Tribute, supplies, horses, submission. With the hounds maintaining a perimeter, resistance was suicide. But it was what happened to those who tried to flee that truly revealed the diabolic sophistication of the Viking strategy. December 865. The winter cold had set in, making the marshlands even more treacherous. A group of roughly 30 refugees from several conquered villages attempted to make their way south through the fens, hoping to reach the relative safety, the fortress at Cambridge. They traveled at night, kept silent, avoided all main roads. On the 3rd night of their journey, they heard it, that distinctive baying in the darkness, deep, resonant, getting closer. A survivor of this group, a young woman named Hilda, described what happened next in testimony that was later transcribed by monks at Ely Cathedral. The refugees tried to scatter, thinking this would confuse the dogs. It did the opposite. The hounds, she said, seemed to divide their attention with uncanny precision, with groups of 2 or 3 dogs pursuing separate clusters of refugees. My uncle Bornwolf ran toward a grove of willows, Hilda testified. The dogs didn't chase him directly. They ran parallel to his path, one on each side, driving him away from cover, away from water, toward open ground. When he tried to double back, they were there, blocking his path. It was like they could read his intentions before he acted on them. Bornwolf was found 2 days later by a Viking patrol, still alive but unable to walk. Both his ankles had been bitten through. The dogs had brought him down, and then, and this is what horrified everyone who heard the account, they had simply guarded him, not killing, not mauling, just preventing escape until their masters arrived. Of the 30 refugees who fled into the fens that December night, 22 were captured alive. 5 were found dead, killed not by the dogs but by exposure and the elements while trying to hide from them. Only 3, including Hilda, managed to reach safety. But perhaps the most chilling incident occurred in early January 866, and it was this event that finally made the broader English kingdoms understand the true horror of what the Vikings had brought to their shores. A minor noble named Leofric, who had sworn allegiance to King Edmund, maintained a fortified estate near what is now Thetford. The estate was surrounded by a wooden palisade, had a well for water, and enough stored grain to withstand a siege of several weeks. Leofric believed he could wait out the Viking invasion, that eventually a relief force would arrive, or the Norsemen would move on to easier targets. On January 12, 866, the Vikings arrived at his gates with 12 hounds. They didn't attack the palisade. They didn't even demand entry. They simply released the dogs inside the compound. Witnesses from nearby farms, too terrified to intervene, watched as the hounds somehow scaled or squeezed through gaps in the wooden walls. Once inside, they began a systematic hunt, not killing, biting tendons, hamstringing, bringing down Leofric's guards and household members one by one, making it impossible for them to mount any organized defense. Within 3 hours, the compound's gates opened from the inside. The Vikings walked in unopposed to find Leofric's entire household, 37 people, incapacitated but alive, the Hounds standing guard over them like shepherds watching a flock. The message was clear: walls meant nothing. Fortifications meant nothing. There was nowhere to hide that the Hounds couldn't reach. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button, and share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. What we're about to uncover gets even more disturbing. Let's discover what happens next. March 20th, 866 AD. The spring thaw had begun, and with it came a discovery that would finally reveal the full scope of the Viking Hound strategy. A group of monks from Ely Abbey, traveling to deliver supplies to refugee communities, found what they initially believed to be a mass grave near the river Ouse. Brother Cuthbert, who led the expedition, described in his written account what they uncovered as the frozen ground surrendered its secrets. The bodies were arranged in a pattern. That was the first thing Cuthbert noted. Not dumped haphazardly, not tossed into a pit, but laid out in deliberate rows. 23 bodies in total, men, women, and children. But what made Brought? Cuthbert's blood run cold wasn't the number of dead. He had seen death before, had buried victims of previous Viking raids. It was the condition of the bodies. Every single corpse showed evidence of being brought down by dogs. The bite patterns were identical across all victims. Deep puncture wounds to the calves and thighs, tearing wounds to the ankles and tendons. But here's what made this discovery different from a simple animal attack. The killing blows were made by human hands. The victims had been dispatched with knives after the dogs had done their work. And there was something else. Something that suggested this wasn't combat or even cruelty for cruelty's sake. Cuthbert documented that many of the bodies showed signs of attempted medical treatment before death. Wounds that had been bound with cloth, herbs that had been applied to injuries. These people had been kept alive after the initial dog attacks, treated, and then, days or perhaps even weeks later, systematically executed. Brother Cuthbert's account raises a horrifying question: why capture, treat, and then kill? The answer came from an unexpected source. A captured Viking warrior, badly wounded in a skirmish with King Edmund's forces, provided testimony in exchange for medical treatment. His name was Thorstein, and what he revealed painted a picture of methodical experimentation that seemed almost impossible for the 9th century. The Great Heathen Army's leaders, Thorstein claimed, had brought specialized dog handlers with them from Scandinavia. These weren't just warriors who happened to own hunting dogs. They were men specifically tasked with training and deploying the hounds as military assets. And they had been testing the dog's effectiveness against human targets. They were perfecting the art, Thorstein said through a translator, of hunting men as our fathers hunted elk. The bodies Brother Cuthbert found weren't casualties of war. They were test subjects. The Vikings had been conducting experiments to determine optimal training techniques, to identify which dog bloodlines performed best, to refine the coordination between hound packs and human handlers. Thorstein described training sessions where captives would be released into the marshlands and given a head start, then tracked by different packs of dogs under varying conditions. The handlers would document which dogs could follow a scent trail across water, which could track in heavy rain, which worked best in pairs versus larger groups. They tested how long a dog could pursue a fleeing human before needing rest. They measured how many humans a single dog could effectively control through intimidation alone. The most disturbing revelation: they were breeding for specific traits. The hounds that showed the best combination of stamina, tracking ability, and controlled aggression, the ones that could bring down a human without killing, were being selectively bred. The Vikings weren't just using dogs they'd brought from home. They were creating a new generation of purpose-bred warhounds on English soil. When King Edmund's forces finally launched a major counteroffensive in late March 866, they discovered the central training compound the Vikings had established near Thetford. What they found there confirmed Thorstein's testimony. The compound contained kennels capable of housing over 100 dogs. There were training yards with obstacles designed to simulate village defenses, wooden palisades for dogs to scale, mock buildings with hiding places for dogs to search, water channels for tracking practice, and there were detailed records, inscribed on wooden tablets in runic script. Later translations of these tablets revealed breeding charts tracking bloodlines across multiple generations, performance records ranking individual dogs by their success rates in hunts, Training schedules, feeding regimens designed to maintain peak physical condition. It was systematic, scientific even, a level of organizational sophistication applied to the weaponization of animals that seemed centuries ahead of its time. But perhaps the most chilling items recovered from the compound were the collars. Dozens of leather collars, each inscribed with runic symbols that translators identified as individual dog names and their kill counts. Not of animals, but of human captures. The highest count belonged to a hound named Fenrir, with 43 marks carved into the leather. When Edmund's forces attempted to clear the compound, they discovered that most of the hounds had already been dispersed among Viking raiding parties spreading across East Anglia. The few dogs that remained had to be killed. They had been trained so thoroughly to attack Anglo-Saxons that they couldn't be captured or controlled. Brother Cuthbert, who witnessed the aftermath, wrote in his chronicle, "These were not beasts acting on savage instinct. These were weapons as surely as any sword or spear, crafted with deliberate purpose by men who understood that fear is as powerful as iron." The discovery at Thetford forced King Edmund and his advisors to confront a horrifying reality. They were fighting an enemy that had fundamentally reimagined the nature of warfare. In April 866, Edmund convened an emergency council at his stronghold in Caster St. Edmund. Representatives from all the major East Anglian settlements attended, along with monks from the region's monasteries who served as record-keepers and advisors. The accounts of this council, preserved in multiple monastic chronicles, reveal the depth of panic that had seized the kingdom. Ealdorman Ethelwold of Suffolk presented the most comprehensive report. His scouts had documented Viking operations across the eastern territories, and the pattern was unmistakable. The Great Heathen Army wasn't just conquering land, they were systematically terrorizing populations into submission using the hounds as psychological weapons. "They don't need to attack every village," Ethelwold reported. "Word spreads faster than their armies. Refugees tell stories of the hounds. Settlements surrender without resistance rather than face the dogs. The Norsemen have conquered through fear itself." The casualty figures Ethelwold presented told a brutal story. Of the estimated 3,000 Anglo-Saxons who had died since the Great Heathen Army's arrival, fewer than 700 had died in actual combat. The rest had been hunted down as they fled, or had died from exposure while hiding in the marshes trying to avoid the dogs, or had been executed after capture. King Edmund faced an impossible strategic dilemma. Traditional military tactics meant nothing against an enemy that could track and pursue scattered forces through any terrain. Fortifications provided no safety. The dogs could infiltrate them. Fleeing was suicide. The dogs were faster and more relentless than any human pursuer. The council debated several desperate solutions. Some advocated for an immediate pitched battle, reasoning that if they could destroy the main Viking force quickly, the dog threat would be neutralized. Others proposed a retreat to the heavily forested regions of western East Anglia, hoping that dense woodland might hinder the hounds. A few even suggested attempting to treat with the Vikings, to offer tribute and submission, rather than face total annihilation. Edmund made a decision that contemporary chroniclers described as both brave and tragic. He would not flee. He would not surrender. Instead, he ordered every village and settlement to adopt new defensive measures specifically designed to counter the hound threat. These measures, distributed through written instructions carried by royal messengers, included detailed protocols. Settlements should maintain constant watch with fires burning at night. As dogs were observed to hesitate at fire lines, communities should dig deep, water-filled trenches around their perimeters, forcing any attacking dogs to swim and breaking the IR momentum. People should coat themselves with strong-smelling substances, fish oil, rotten eggs, manure, to confuse the hound's tracking ability. Anyone fleeing should head toward running water and wade along streams to break scent trails. Archaeological evidence from this period supports the implementation of these defensive measures. Excavations at several East Anglian settlement sites from the late 860s show evidence of hastily dug defensive trenches, fire pits positioned at regular intervals around village perimeters, and modified building layouts that suggest communities were preparing for attacks by fast-moving forces that could penetrate traditional barriers. But these preparations came too late for many. The summer of 866 saw the systematic conquest of East Anglia continue. The Vikings, now fully aware of the psychological impact their hounds had created, used them with increasing sophistication. They developed coordinated tactics where dog packs would flush populations from fortified positions directly into waiting shield walls. They used the hounds for night raids, exploiting the dog's superior night vision and tracking abilities. They even deployed them for targeted assassinations, using scent trails to track specific high-value targets across vast distances. One particularly detailed account from this period describes how Bishop Humbert of Elmham was tracked for 3 days across the East Anglian countryside by a pack of 6 hounds. Despite his attempts to use water, disguises, and multiple diversions, the dogs remained on his trail. He was finally captured attempting to reach the safety of a monastery at Peterborough, brought down by the hounds less than a mile from sanctuary. The legal and moral implications of this form of warfare troubled both contemporaries and later chroniclers. The Anglo-Saxon tradition of warfare, while brutal, operated under certain unwritten rules, concepts of honor in combat, the treatment of non-combatants, the sanctuary offered by churches. The Viking use of hounds violated all of these conventions. How does one charge a dog with war crimes? How does one negotiate rules of engagement with animals? The very premise of the hound strategy existed outside the established framework of 9th century warfare, making legal or diplomatic responses essentially impossible. By November 20th, 869 AD, King Edmund's position had become untenable. The sources differ on exactly what happened, but the most reliable accounts suggest that Edmund attempted one final confrontation with the Great Heathen Army at Hoxne in Suffolk. The battle was a disaster. The English forces, already depleted and demoralized, were routed. Edmund himself was captured. According to the Passion of St. Edmund, written shortly after his death, the king was subjected to torture and eventually executed by the Vikings. While later hagiographies embellished his martyrdom with miraculous elements, the historical core of the story includes one consistently reported detail. Edmund was tracked and captured with the aid of Viking hounds. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that after Edmund's death, East Anglia essentially ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The surviving population submitted to Viking rule, but the chronicle also includes a curious notation that appears in several manuscript versions, and the people feared the hounds more than they feared the sword. In the years that followed, the Great Heathen Army moved on to conquer Northumbria and Mercia, and there is evidence they continued to use their war hounds. Archaeological excavations at the Viking Great Army's winter camp at Repton in Mercia have uncovered mass graves that include both human and canine remains, some showing evidence of the same training-related injuries found in the Thetford kennel site. But something changed after Edmund's death. The surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, particularly Wessex under Alfred the Great, developed increasingly sophisticated counter measures to the hound threat. Alfred's military reforms included the establishment of a network of fortified burhs that incorporated specific anti-dog defenses. His army included specialized units trained to use spears and bows to neutralize hounds before they could close to attack range. More significantly, Alfred recognized that fighting terror required undermining its psychological foundation. His chroniclers deliberately downplayed Viking hound attacks in official records, shifting narratives from fearsome war beasts to ordinary hunting dogs. Alfred's propaganda machine worked to demystify and diminish the hound threat, gradually eroding the supernatural terror they had initially inspired. By the 880s, references to Viking warhounds begin to disappear from Anglo-Saxon sources. Whether this reflects an actual decline in their use or simply a successful propaganda campaign to stop spreading fear is difficult to determine. Archaeological evidence suggests the Viking settlers who established themselves in the Danelaw continued to breed large hunting dogs, but these seem to have returned to primarily civilian purposes, hunting game rather than humans. The legacy of the Great Heathen Army's warhounds extends far beyond the immediate horror of the Viking conquest. In the realm of military history, this represents one of the earliest documented examples of systematic psychological warfare combined with animal deployment. While armies throughout history had used dogs, the Romans employed them, as did various ancient civilizations. The Vikings' methodical approach to breeding, training, and deploying hounds specifically to terrorize civilian populations represented a significant evolution in military thinking. Modern military historians now recognize that the Great Heathen Army's tactics anticipated by nearly 1,000 years the psychological operations that would become central to 20th century warfare. The principle is the same: attack not just the enemy's body but their will to resist. Create fear that spreads beyond your actual physical reach. Make the threat of violence more effective than violence itself. The impact on English law and governance was equally profound, though often overlooked. Alfred the Great's legal code, compiled in the late 880s, includes specific provisions regarding the ownership and control of large dogs. These laws required dog owners to prevent their animals from harming people, established liability for injuries caused by dogs, and even mandated the destruction of dogs deemed dangerous to the public. Legal scholars have traced the lineage of these provisions through medieval English law all the way to modern concepts of dangerous dog legislation. But perhaps the most fascinating legacy is cultural and psychological. The Viking Hound attacks created a trauma that embedded itself in Anglo-Saxon collective memory, and eventually became woven into English folklore and legend. Consider the timing. The Great Heathen Army's campaign occurred in the 860s. Within 2 centuries, English legends began featuring supernatural hounds, black dogs, hellhounds, spectral hunting packs. The famous legend of the Black Dog of Bungay, said to have appeared in a Suffolk church in 1577, occurred in Viking-conquered East Anglia. The Wild Hunt, featuring spectral hounds chasing damned souls, became a pan-European legend, but has particularly strong traditions in areas of England that experienced Viking occupation. Could these supernatural legends have their roots in the very real terror of Viking warhounds? Folk memory has a way of transforming historical trauma into myth, of processing collective fear through storytelling that strips away specific historical details while preserving emotional truth. The genetic legacy is also tangible. DNA studies of modern British dog breeds have identified Scandinavian genetic markers that date to the Viking Age, the Old English Sheepdog, the English Mastiff, even some bloodlines of modern age hunting breeds show evidence of Viking-era Scandinavian dog genetics. The very hounds that terrorized Anglo-Saxon England contributed to the development of breeds that would become quintessentially English. From a broader perspective of human nature, the Viking warhound strategy reveals something uncomfortable about our species. The domestication of dogs represents one of humanity's greatest partnerships, a mutual alliance between 2 species that has endured for tens of thousands of years. Dogs have been our companions, protectors, helpers. But the Viking deployment of hounds demonstrates how that sacred partnership could be perverted. The same traits we bred into dogs to make them loyal companions, their desire to please, their pack mentality, their ability to learn complex tasks, could be turned toward systematically hunting humans. It raises questions that remain relevant today. What is our ethical responsibility when we breed and train animals for specific purposes? Where is the line between legitimate use and abuse? How do we reconcile our love for dogs as companions with the historical reality that they have also been weapons? Similar patterns have emerged throughout history. The Spanish conquistadors used war dogs against indigenous peoples in the Americas. European colonial powers deployed dogs to track escaped slaves and hunt resistance fighters. In the 20th century, attack dogs were used by totalitarian regimes to terrorize populations. The fundamental tactic, using trained canines to hunt and terrorize human beings, has been repeated across cultures and centuries. The Viking warhounds of 865 AD weren't the first instance of this abuse, and tragically they weren't the last. But they may be among the best documented for their era, providing us with an unusually clear window into how systematic this practice could become even in the 9th century. For the people of East Anglia, the trauma was generational. Chronicles from the late 9th and early 10th centuries describe communities that had developed deep-seated fears of large dogs, populations that would flee at the sound of baying hounds even decades after the Viking conquest. Psychological wounds, passed from parents to children through stories and warnings, creating a cultural memory of fear. And yet, paradoxically, those same communities eventually absorbed their Viking conquerors. The Danelaw, the region of England under Viking control, saw a blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norse cultures, intermarriage, cultural exchange, economic cooperation. Within a few generations, the descendants of those who had been hunted by Viking hounds were living peacefully alongside the descendants of the Vikings themselves. This capacity for healing, for forgiveness, for moving beyond trauma, might be the most remarkable part of the entire story. Humans can be monsters to each other. We can devise extraordinarily cruel methods of inflicting suffering. We can turn even our most loyal companions into weapons. But we also possess the capacity to overcome, to forgive, to build new societies from the ruins of the old. The East Anglian communities that suffered under the Viking warhounds eventually became part of the richest, most culturally diverse region of medieval England. The Great Heathen Army's warhounds represent one of the darkest chapters of the Viking Age, a systematic campaign of terror that weaponized humanity's oldest animal companion against defenseless populations. From the marshlands of East Anglia to the kennels of Thetford, the Vikings demonstrated that innovation in warfare often means finding new ways to inspire fear. What do you think drove the Viking leaders to develop such a methodical approach to terrorizing civilian populations? Was it pure military pragmatism, or something darker? Leave your theories in the comments below. If this forgotten chapter of Viking history fascinated you, Make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost stories from the shadows of history. Hi. Dat notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next dark mystery. What other aspects of Viking warfare should we explore? What other historical horrors have been forgotten by mainstream history? Your comments help guide our research into the past's darkest corners. Thank you for joining us on this journey into 865 AD. Remember, the most terrifying monsters in history aren't supernatural. They're the ones we create ourselves. See you in the next video.